Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Today we are speaking about community-based social marketing, part 2 of our webinar series focused on barrier benefit research. So this is part of a larger project focused on increasing capacity to do these kind of behavior change programs in the Chesapeake, focused on improvements to the bay, be they water quality or such, through individual behavior change. So this is part of a series, but we'll be touching on specifically barrier and benefit research today. So before we get started, I just want to thank our funders. So this project has been funded wholly or in part by the United States Environmental Protection Agency under assistance agreement to the Chesapeake Bay Trust. The contents of this document do not reflect the views and policies of the Environmental Protection Agency, nor does the EPA endorse trade names or recommend the use of commercial products mentioned in this document. So myself and Jennifer Tabanico are part of an organization called Action Research. We are a consulting group that seeks to apply marketing and social science research to outreach programs to promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities through applying community-based social marketing and best practices in communication and social science to specifically achieve these environmental and health-related goals. First, a few announcements before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, so it'll be available at a later date and posted on the Chesapeake Bay Programs Communication Group's website. We ask that everyone who is not speaking mute your phones, just so we avoid any feedback. As mentioned, this is part of a series, so this is building on a CBSM training that was conducted back in October of 2019, actually on Halloween. So we had a one-day training down at the down in the Bay Area. We also have a 1-hour overview that was recorded instead of that. So if you're unable to make that training, that 1-hour overview is available on the communication program website as well. The first webinar, which focused on behavior selection, is also available or will be available soon, posted on that website as well. We will be doing questions and answers either throughout or we'll be holding time at the end. There should be a chat box on your screen that you can use to submit any questions, and we'll check in on that occasionally and then also address anyone at the end. So as mentioned, it's part of the series, so behavior selection was already completed back last month and has been recorded and should be posted soon if not already. Today is barrier benefit research. Next month will be strategy development, so in March, and then pilot testing in April. Speakers today are myself, Caitlin Phelps. So I am a senior project manager at Action Research for the last 7 years, working in community-based social marketing. I got my master's in behavioral psychology with a focus on environmental science at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. While I was there, I was actually part of a graduate student team that worked with the Chesapeake Bay Trust on how to help build organizational capacity to do behavioral programs. We've actually been working down in the Bay doing these behavioral capacity building for a while, and I'm really excited to continue to be part of that effort, knowing that there's just so many great organizations down here doing amazing work, and I'm really excited to help support that. Jennifer Tabanico has her master's in experimental psychology and has over 15 years of experience doing this community-based social marketing work across multiple areas, from waste to forestry, conservation, energy, all sorts of things, and all sorts of different types of organizations, governmental, NGOs, private organizations, and is our leader at Action Research. And you'll see that kind of experience reflected in the examples she gives and that we give throughout our presentation. So I will be speaking first, doing kind of an introduction to CBSM and an overview of barrier benefit research methodology, and then Jennifer is going to dig into survey design and intercept surveys, which is the most common technique used by organizations that aren't hiring an external consultant. So first, Just a quick overview to CBSM and what it is. As mentioned, there's a 1-hour overview that goes through the whole process, as well as on cbsm.com. There's a freely available book from Doug Mackenzie Moore. But just to give us some quick context here, CBSM has its origins in social science, so based on best practices of psychology, sociology, anthropology, so based on hundreds of years of research on human behavior, why we do what we do, and how do we motivate changes. As mentioned in the name, it's community-based, so really focused on how can we address this behavior in this community, rather than focus on really broad efforts across everyone, but really helping this specific target audience make a change. The goal is to remove barriers, so what prevents people from taking the action. So rather than just focusing on how can we make them more knowledgeable or how can we make them more aware of issues, how can we really understand what stops people from acting and remove it through outreach or programming. And finally, it's based on behaviors. So rather than focusing on just measuring outputs such as attendance to a workshop or hits to a website, it's really focused on how can we measure, did people change their behavior? Do we see measurable changes in the outcomes we're seeking, such as improvement in water quality, reduction in energy usage? CBSM is a 5-step process, starting by selecting behaviors, so selecting those behaviors that will have the greatest impact on the outcomes we're hoping to achieve, learning what barriers and benefits our target audience has to taking the actions we want them to, developing a strategy that helps overcome those barriers and leverage the benefits the audience finds meaningful, pilot testing on a small scale to make sure it works before we scale up to implementing broadly and evaluating. Today I'll be focused specifically on the barrier and benefit portion of this process. So step 2 of identifying barriers and benefits. The question is really, why are people not engaging in the behavior we want them to? So once we have gone through step 1 of really understanding what behaviors have a meaningful impact on the outcome we're hoping to achieve. So for example, if you're hoping to reduce residential water use, we might look at people taking shorter showers, reducing lawn watering, turning off the sink while you're brushing your teeth, other behaviors. And once we kind of focus on 3 to 5, which is about how many behaviors we can reasonably do a research effort on, really understanding, well, why are people not already taking these actions? These barriers may be external, so things like if they need to install technology they have weather-based sensors on their irrigation system, there might not be contractors available, or there might not be systems available in the store. If we want people to, say, plant trees, are there, and specifically native trees, are those trees available in stores around them? On the other hand, they might be internal, so based on the lack of motivation, time, or things that are internal to the participant, to the audience. And these barriers can vary by different behaviors. So from that example of water conservation, there's likely different reasons that people continue to water their lawn as compared to why they continue to take longer showers or leave the water running in other situations. So we need to really be specific about what behavior we're going after because there are different barriers, likely different barriers to it, but need to be addressed in different ways. Barriers can also vary by different audiences. So likely a family with small children is going to have different barriers to an action than an elderly couple is going to have different barriers to a young person living on their own or living with a lot of roommates. They can also vary by season. So the reason that I may not bike to work, for example, likely varies between summer and winter, and any other outdoor behaviors likely vary through different times of year. They can also vary over time as different technologies are developed, as different programs are run, as culture changes, these things can change. So we're first going to go over the different research modes. I'm going to give an overview of each of these modes that you might use to collect data on your audience and the times that you might use them and the ways you might use them. And then as mentioned, Jennifer is going to go into depth on surveys as specific to Intercept interviews. So the first methodology is a literature review. We always recommend this as a good place to start because anyone can do reading through a few, looking for case studies, seeing if other people have done this, especially down in this region. There's the ChesapeakeBehaviorChange.com, I think it is, website. The Trust, there's a lot of resources. A lot of organizations out here share a lot of information. Really great. Don't reinvent the wheel if things have already been researched, if programs have already been conducted and seen success. Great to learn from that. So you're looking to identify existing reports and look at the range of behaviors and barriers that they identified as important and how they may have addressed them. The main challenge you run into with literature review is potentially limited generalizability. So if the research was conducted in a very different region of the country or with a very different audience, they might have different challenges. As mentioned, those barriers can vary by different audiences, by different areas. So it might not fully apply to your research, but it's still going to be helpful to learn from and leverage those reports. Next, you may choose to learn through behavioral observations. So this is a great technique to use for naturally occurring behavior that occurs in public spaces. So for example, we do a lot of behavioral observations with littering behavior. So seeing where people litter, what they litter, and making inferences as to why. So this can especially help identify infrastructure challenges. So for example, if you find that there's a lot of litter at transit locations and you set someone up there to observe and see what gets littered and when it gets littered, and note that everyone is really throwing things out right as they get on the bus because the bus doesn't allow you to have liquids on it. You might say we need to set up a trash can right by the entrance to this bus stop, and so people are throwing it in the trash rather than throwing it on the ground. But conversely, if you'd sat someone up there and didn't see that happening, you might say, oh, well, this litter is, I guess, being blown in from somewhere else because we sat and observed the site for, a couple days and really no one was dropping litter on the ground. So all this litter must be coming from elsewhere, which helps you identify what is the problem and how do I address it. The biggest challenge with behavioral observations is first, as mentioned, they can take some time. So you have to sit and watch and have someone sitting and watching and observing. Also about access. If we're interested in private behaviors, so things that happen in people's homes or in potentially in their workplaces, things like that, can be a challenge to observe. The next is focus groups. So this is a group discussion of 5 to 8 people that we recruit either through stopping people at public locations, through telephone recruitment, depending on the type of audience. If we have a listed sample for them, you may have participated in one of these focus groups at some point. Really looking to do an in-depth exploration of a topic or to do message testing, so seeing what people think about a message and getting to really talk it out, hear what they think, give you their interpretations, and ask follow-up questions. So it's a unique opportunity to get qualitative data and have a group discussion. There's a lot of good guides on how to facilitate these groups. It does take someone who's good at making sure they don't insert their own opinions and keep the discussion going. In terms of barrier-benefit research, it's really good if it's a novel topic, so one that's never really been researched before. So it's hard for you to say, well, what might be this full list of barriers that people are facing? We don't know. We really need to learn more from our audience first. Or if you have a very specific group that you're trying to reach, so if you're trying to reach a very limited sample that you wouldn't likely encounter if you just set up somewhere randomly, so people who have a specific kind of job, for example, it's really good for that. It's just important to keep in mind that these groups are not representative samples. So just because, say, 4 people out of 8 in your focus group said something, that doesn't mean that 50% of your target audience said something. It just means that this group feels that way. So it can be really helpful and informative, but just important to keep in mind when you're interpreting your data. The next method is an in-depth interview. So a lot of the same kind of reasons for using that as a focus group. So if you want to really explore a topic, be able to ask follow-up questions, You can do these in person or by phone. They can be really helpful for if you're trying to reach, for example, a business or commercial audience. They may be unlikely to want to gather as a focus group and speak to their competitors about the topic. But if you want to, say, learn more from a contractor audience, this can be a really great methodology to use. Also, again, with the complex topics, that you can ask follow-up questions and clarify things, explain things. But just as with the focus groups and with the behavioral observations, you have to take time to recruit people, get these set up, and actually get the interviews done and then analyzed. Next is mail surveys. So this is speaking to quantitative data. So the last thing we really covered focused on qualitative data, which is really digging into depth and understanding people's full thoughts, which can be very helpful for exploration. It doesn't speak to what are averages across our entire audience. So quantitative data can help us because we have, and it's what people, first comes to mind when you ask them the question, as opposed to having a list of different potential barriers that you might face when trying to do the target behavior and having people rank them, rate how important or how much they agree. And Jennifer will dig into a little bit more about how specifically you ask these questions. But really what we can get from it is we can prioritize a list of potential barriers by how strongly the audience feels about them. And that helps us go after, well, these three are clearly the most important to our audience. That's what we should really focus our program on targeting. Alternatively, depending on your sample size, you may be able to break up your audience and speak to, well, people in this neighborhood have these different barriers because of, say, different structural or external issues they face because of where they live. They're also really good for targeted community issues. So if you want to know what a specific town thinks or a community thinks, you'll have an address list you can go after and randomly select from that list and generate a representative sample so you can speak to what the whole audience feels. However, they are time intensive to design, send out. We usually find we get a response rate of about 20 to 30% using the Dillman-Taylor design methodology, which we'll link to at the end to get really strong survey results, but it just, of course, takes time. Another method is a telephone survey. This is falling out of favor with just given the amount of robocalls and challenges that people face to getting people to answer calls that they don't know the number of. However, this can still be a really good use for complex surveys where you have skips. So if you want to get a little bit more complex with your topic, skips tend to be a challenge with written surveys where people will read over the skip or answer it improperly. So if you want to, if yes, go through this other train, if no, go through this other train, telephone surveys are really good for that kind of survey design. You can use a listed sample or you can do random digit dial. Typically you want to contract this out to someone who does these surveys. There's a lot of specific methodology on how you recruit a sample and make sure it's representative. They can be very quick, so a good company can accomplish this kind of data collection in even a couple days, depending on how much you want and how broad your sample is, but they can be very costly, especially as cell phone and telephone technologies have changed. Web surveys are something you've probably seen before and considered or may have already used. There's a lot of different ways you can put them out. They can be through a panel. This is people who typically take surveys and they get paid to take surveys. SurveyMonkey offers them as well as other survey websites. You can send them out to a list that you have, say your membership list for an organization, or you can post a link in some kind of social media or other sharing location. It's really good for a known audience. So if you want to sample your membership list or employees in a workplace, really great because you have their email addresses already and you have the full list of samples, similarly to if you wanted to go out for community and you have their home address list. The upside of web surveys is they are very quick and inexpensive. Challenges are generally, even with best practices of having, say, in a workplace, having the boss speak to, it's very important to fill out the survey and such, we still see very low response rates. For posting links to things like Nextdoor or your social media, there is just always the challenge of bias of who is answering that survey. So the kind of person that follows your organization on social media, or the kind of person that signs up on Nextdoor. It's not to say that these aren't methods that you can use. As mentioned, they are very quick and inexpensive. It can help gather data, and it's always better to base decisions on data than on no data at all. But it's just important to keep in mind when you are using this data to remember how you collected it and in what ways it might be biased and therefore influencing the kind of program you develop. Finally, intercept interviews. So this is, and as you see in these photos, when we have someone out with a clipboard who has a short survey with them asking people to fill them out in a public location. So you would go to the community you're interested in working in. So if you are working with, say, a specific town or a specific city, you would go somewhere in there. We often hand up these at libraries when we're looking for kind of a general audience, as libraries are very willing to have people kind of out, standing by. As mentioned in the last bullet there, one of the challenges being access to permission to be on site. They are usually brief, so 5 to 7 minutes to fill out the survey. We may hand out gift cards with them, or people are often willing to fill them out as long as the survey is very short. They are really focused on whatever topics we are trying to understand. So again, that 5 to 7 minutes to complete, short survey, one-sided, maybe two-sided, but really trying to keep it focused on just a few questions, and good for really going after also a hard-to-reach sample. So if there's a specific location where your sample might be, so if you're looking to reach people that go to a certain park or location, you can actually go to that location and reach people who you know go to that park. Or say you're looking for dog walkers going to paths where dogs are typically walked. And rather than having to ask your sample, via phone calls or things, if they do that first, because you found them at the location you're looking for. So when selecting research modes, it's important to consider what types of questions you want to answer. So, for example, the qualitative versus quantitative information. How complex is the topic you're looking at? Is it something that we can go through in a survey, or we're going to need to ask a lot of follow-up questions? Who is your audience, and how are you able to find them? Do you have address lists? Do you have email lists? Who are they, and different ways to reach out to them? And what constraints do you have for your time, budget, and expertise? Really, the biggest thing is just to never base your barrier and benefit information on your hunches or assumptions, because we are different than the target audience we're trying to reach. And we always want to encourage, wherever possible, using data to make decisions as opposed to guessing at why people may or may not be taking the action we want them to. As mentioned in this, there are strategic ways we can choose what mode of research we use based on what we're trying to learn and who we're trying to reach. And if you're short on time or budget, as mentioned, literature reviews are always good, especially in the Chesapeake region. There's a lot of great information being shared, things you can leverage and learn. Intercept interviews are generally a quick way to get a little bit more information on the topic, ground truth it, so you can say there was this big research that was done. It was done in a different region of the country, but we did a short intercept interview and found our audience of 50 or so people showed the same patterns of top barriers so we can feel confident that this is the pathway we should go. And with that, I will turn over control to Jennifer, and we will dig into surveys.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for the overview of the various research types. And when we were putting together this webinar, we kind of tried to think where we could dive in deeper that would be most useful. And in looking at the types of organizations that are across the Chesapeake Bay and the size of those organizations, we really thought that a deeper dive into how to structure and implement intercept surveys would be most useful. As Katie mentioned, there are a variety of different research modes. Some of those require the support of a consultant. So a telephone survey, you would need to hire a facility that has automated computer software to administer those. But very often, intercept surveys are the kinds of things that we're doing with local audiences and targeted community issues. That being said, all of the concepts that I'm going to be presenting for the rest of this webinar are relevant to the development of instruments for focus groups, for mail surveys, for telephone surveys. So even if you are working within your own organizations or with consultants on surveys, you're very often asked to offer input. So these techniques will kind of give you sort of better knowledge about how to be critical of those and make sure that you're getting good quality, not just for intercepts, but relevant across some other modes as well.
Okay.
So getting started. Very often when we work with agencies and writing surveys, that the temptation is to just start numbering right down the list and start writing questions. But like anything else, everything else that we've been talking to, there's a science behind writing surveys. And we could do an entire webinar series on that. But I really wanted to hit on the key basics so that if you do intercept surveys in your communities or you're working with consultants, that you can follow this basic process. So first, in getting started with writing a survey, the first thing you want to do is clarify the objective. So that is, why are you doing this survey, and what do you hope to learn as a result? And this really is going to help guide everything that comes after it, from the questions that are on the survey to the types of response categories you provide to the locations you may go to administer. So what are you hoping to learn? And very often this should be done with the core group that's going to be developing this strategy to make sure everyone's on the same page. As Katie mentioned, each of those research modes do take time, they do take resources. So the worst thing that can happen is that you develop a survey, you administer the survey, and at the end there are really critical questions that you didn't answer. And you really have that one opportunity to go to your audience get the information. So this is a really useful starting point. Very often we'll write this as a mission statement and then check everything we do back against the mission statement. So those of you who might be working on Living Shorelines projects or the aquatic vegetation, that you'll know that very often, even in those types of situations where we have a working group, we have an objective right at the start of the agenda. So we can always be reminding ourselves why we're doing this work. We can both have primary and secondary objectives. So maybe your primary objective is to learn about barriers and benefits to a specific behavior, but you may have a secondary objective to learn about knowledge or to learn about communication avenues that you might be utilized. So you can spell those things out right at the outset. Once you've clarified...
Jennifer, hold on one second. Somebody's phone lines are not muted, and I think there's about 3 of you that haven't. Can you please take a moment to do so? Thank you.
Okay, so even once you have the objective narrowed down, we still aren't at the point of writing questions. To get started, though, the next thing that we do is to list the concepts that we want to measure. So this can be done on a whiteboard, it can be done on a piece of paper, in a document, but you want to be thinking very broadly. So what are all of the concepts that you want to ask about? Do you want to ask about the types of property that people have? Do you want to ask about their existing behaviors? Do you want to ask about their past behavior? Do you want to ask about characteristics of the household, the barriers to specific actions? What are the behaviors you want to ask about? So at this point, there really doesn't need to be any organization or structure, but rather just listing everything that comes to mind that you want to ask about. In terms of coming up with those concepts, you might also look at other surveys that have been done on the topic to see what others have asked about and maybe include that on your list. At this point, we're focusing on themes, not the specific wording of the question. So still not writing questions yet, but rather broad topics. Once you have a comprehensive list, then you go back through that list and check it against your objective statement. And so asking yourself for each one of those items, does asking about this topic meet the need of the research? Does it give us the information that we need in order to meet our objective? If it doesn't, you want to cross it off the list. And this is for two reasons. Even though something that might be interesting to know, if it's interesting to know but you don't need to know it, then it shouldn't be on your survey. And the reason for that is, again, because these surveys do take time. You're taking the time not just of your own resources to administer the survey and that staff time, but also the time and effort of the participant. And so it's very important to be responsible about and thoughtful about what items are going on to the survey. So one way to begin to narrow that down is to check each of those items against your objective. Do I need to know it, or is it just interesting to know, and does it help me to meet the goal of the research? Once you have that list narrowed down into things you need to know, next we want to organize those into groupings. So what are all of the topics around behavior? What are all of the topics around knowledge and attitudes? Or maybe it's property-related questions versus workplace-related questions. It will vary depending on your topic, but you want to organize them into logical groupings, and this will help move you toward writing a survey instrument. So now, the next thing to do is to begin to write the questions, and in doing that, we want to be thinking about the different types of question formats that are available to you. So first, determining whether you want open-ended items or closed-ended items. Open-ended items are things like, what did you eat for dinner last night? And so you're just asking a broad question, and the participant can offer their response. So what behavior changes have you made in the last year to protect water quality? That's another example of an open-ended item. So the participant is offering their version or their response in an open-ended manner that's not constrained by any categories or scales. Open-ended items are typical of what you would ask in a focus group or in an interview type situation where you're really trying to get in-depth, qualitative, rich information, and they can be useful at some points in surveys, but they also are very time-consuming to interpret, and we can't analyze them in a quantitative way. So in choosing whether the balance of open-ended versus closed-ended items, you really want to be thoughtful about how much time you have to analyze and whether that question could be answered asked in a different way. Open-ended items tend to take longer. People will converse with you longer, and as I mentioned, they take longer to analyze and harder to interpret. Closed-ended items, on the other hand, are things like yes or no, using a scale, or asking people to choose from a list of items which things they do. So you're constraining the choices and offering the participant the option to select from those. There are ways to do a hybrid. So one would be, an example of that would be providing people with a list of things that they've done and then providing an other option, and then following the other they could explain. Again, these other options need to be categorized. Does it really fit into one of the other categories you already have, or do you need to create a new category? So making these decisions at the forefront is really important. Most of the time on these types of surveys, we are using some type of scale, and so there are some decisions you need to make around scales as well. Typically, we recommend that any type of scale item, so you're asking people to rate something on a scale from 1 to 5, 0 to 10, the scales can vary. Typically, we recommend that you use larger scales rather than scales of, say, 3 or 4 points. So instead of a 1, 2, 3, or 4, maybe a 0 to 10, which offers 11 points. And what that does is introduce more variability into your survey. So if you have something that most people agree with and you ask on a 1 to 4 scale, you're going to have a whole bunch of respondents, maybe 98% of people gave it a 4. Okay, well that doesn't tell you as much as if you ask the same question on a 0 to 10, and maybe 10% of people give it a 10, 8% give it a 9, 7% give it an 8, and then 50% give it a 7. That tells you a little bit more, so people aren't entirely favorable, maybe they're a little bit left of favorable. So that's sort of the primary reason for using those larger scales, is to give you a finer grain look at where people's attitudes, opinions, or behaviors really lie. The second thing you want to consider is whether or not you want a midpoint. So whether you want to use a 0 to, or a 1 to 6 or a 1 to 7, one of those will have a midpoint, the other will not. And it really is a internal discussion that you should be having. Do you want people to have the option of giving a neutral response of, I don't feel one way or the other, or do you want to force people into some level of agreement as to the left or to the right? So again, that really comes down to the topic you're asking about and internal discussions about what you want out of the research. Really important with whatever scale you use, no matter how many points you use, is to only anchor the endpoints. And I'll show you some examples of this a little bit later on. And what I mean by that is if you have a scale from 1 to 6 and you label each of the points, where 1 is strongly disagree, and 2 is somewhat disagree, and 3 is disagree, and 4 is neutral, and 5 is somewhat agree, what you've done then is take a numerical scale and turned it into a categorical scale, where each response falls into a category of agreement. And what this assumes is that there's equal distance between one number and the next. So that it assumes that the distance between a strongly disagree and a somewhat disagree is the same as the distance between a somewhat disagree and a disagree, which is the same as the distance between a disagree and a neutral. And it really doesn't work that way with categorical items. So importantly, what we do in that case is label the endpoint. So where if you have a 0 to 10, for example, 0 is no agreement, 10 is absolute agreement, and then you have that range in between. And what we can assume there is that the distance between a 0 and a 1 is the same as the distance between a 1 and a 2, which is the same as the difference between a 2 and a 3, and so on. So if you use those scales, the thing to remember is to not label every number on the scale, but rather label the two endpoints, the lowest end and the highest end. There's nothing wrong with categorical and putting things into categories. However, it limits what you can do statistically. So with a 0 to 10 scale, you can calculate averages and standard deviations. You can test differences between groups. Whereas once you apply labels to each item, you're putting people into those categories, and you can only report frequencies. So in other words, you can only say 25% of people strongly disagreed, 10% of people agreed, 20% of people strongly agreed. And so you're putting people, and if that's what you want to know, that is okay. But if you really want to compare how much one barrier is to another, or levels of behavior, it's better to have those averages and other statistics available to you. So here's an example of a scale in which the anchors are labeled. This was some work that Katie did in Massachusetts related to water conservation. And so an example of how a question might be framed would be like this: using a scale from 0, not at all important, to 10, extremely important. How important is it to your household to have a green lawn during the summer? So that would tell you 0 agreement is absolute, extreme agreement, no doubt about it, is absolute, and then there's variability in between. And then you can follow from that. People can learn the scales pretty quickly and answer items like this very easily using the same scale. How important is it to your household to save water during the summer? Again, from 0 to 10. You could ask a number of items this way, and people can move through them pretty quickly because the scale is predictable and consistent. So again, just talking a little bit more about the different question formats, expanding on categorical. Categorical items you're going to use when the distance between those ratings doesn't matter. So when you're not concerned about agreement across the spectrum, but you really want to put people into categories. So when you want to be using categorical items are when you're asking about things like gender, male or female or prefer not to identify, and so on. Home ownership, do you own or do you rent? Level of education. Knowledge about particular topics can be categorical. So asking people if they know whether or not water is treated before being released into the waterways, whether stormwater is treated. You might provide different response categories, and people report their level of knowledge. So these are all categorical items where you're less concerned about creating averages. You're not concerned about creating an average level of education or an average level of home ownership. You really want to be looking at the distribution. So that's the most appropriate types of topics for using categorical formats. So now thinking back to the types of items, so you've decided, you've listed the categories that you want to ask about and narrowed those down and matched them against your objectives. You've thought through whether items should be categorical or whether they should be scaled. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how to ask questions around the specific types of themes that might be on your survey, and specifically as it relates to community-based social marketing. So one of the things that we are likely going to be asking about on a survey within community-based social marketing is their current behavior. So what are they doing now? In doing this, we want to be very specific. So we don't want to be asking things like, do you conserve water? We want to be asking things like, do you take showers that are 5 minutes or less? Or do you turn off your irrigation systems before rain? Or do you apply fertilizer during these months? So we don't want to be asking broad questions, but actually very specific questions related to those individual actions. And we find that it's very helpful to also time constrain those actions, particularly if they're actions that aren't very frequent. So very often we'll think through, ask about the last year or the last 6 months or the last week, depending on how frequent that behavior is. So you might say, in the last year, have you planted any native plants on your property? Or in the last year, have you applied fertilizer to areas on your property? So that's easier for people to remember and report accurately than if you say something like, have you ever done that? And so we typically find that usually in the last year or in the last 6 months constrains it enough that people can provide accurate recollection of their current behaviors. We can also ask about behavioral intention. That is, if it's something they haven't done already, how likely or do they plan to do it in the future? So maybe they plan to install living shorelines, but they haven't actually taken the actions yet. So you can ask then in the next year or in the next couple of months, do you plan to engage in the behavior? Again, it's time constrained and specific to the actions that you're targeting. So here's an example of an Intercept survey in which people were asked about their behavior, because sometimes this is kind of another way to help people to answer accurately, and that is by providing photographs. So in this particular example, we were asking people about their application of salt to the areas the hard surfaces outside their home to prevent freezing. And so that's something that's kind of hard for people to answer in terms of how much salt did you apply. So in this case, we asked, when you or your household use salt, which picture best represents how the ground typically looks when you are finished applying? So thinking about planting of trees or installing or maintaining living shorelines, this might be another area where it's hard for people to describe what they did, but you might be able to show them a series of pictures and allow them to report. So critical to efforts on community-based social marketing are understanding the barriers and the benefits to specific actions. And there's a few different ways that you can ask this. One, and I'll show you some examples. One way to ask it is, how much is lack of time, for example, a barrier that prevents you from installing living shoreline on your property? Or how much is cost a barrier that prevents you from planting a tree on your property? So in that case, you would use a scale where people would say 0, it's not a barrier at all, to 10, it's a major barrier. Another way to ask that is to say something like, how much does X make it difficult for you to engage in the behavior? So two different ways. You're asking people, how much is this a barrier, or how much does it make it difficult for you to do this? You could also ask this in an open-ended format. This would be a good way to ask it if you're really short on time. You maybe only have time to ask the participants 2 questions, one about barriers and one about benefits. Or if you don't know a lot yet about what the list of barriers might be. So in those scale items, you're naming the barriers for people and allowing them to rate them using a scale. The open-ended format is asking the participant to report what those barriers are. So in that case, we would ask it something like, what makes it difficult for you to do X? And the participant offers a response, and then you can then categorize those after the fact. Similarly, with benefits, we structure them much the same way. So how much is protecting the environment a factor in your decision to reduce amount of fertilizer? Or you can ask about importance. How important is protecting fish habitat as a reason to install living shorelines? So you can, again, you start with a list of benefits here and tie them to specific behaviors and allow people to rate each one. Alternatively, as you did with barriers, we can ask open-ended. So what do you see as a benefit of doing whatever, insert behavior that you're interested in? And this can be asked. Each of the behaviors that you're interested in, as Katie mentioned, typically on these surveys, we're constrained to about 3 to 5 behaviors, depending on their complexity. But we want to know for each of the behaviors that you're interested in, what is their current level of behavior or intended behavior, and then what are the benefits and barriers that are related to those specific actions. So here's an example of a way in which we've combined both barriers and benefits into the same list. And what this strategy does is ensure that your barriers and benefits are kind of on the same scale. So if you ask about benefits first, things are going to skew really high, and benefits tend to skew really low. But by combining it cognitively, people kind of keep things on the same scale. So this is a practice that we've been adopting more recently in terms of keeping things that are reasons to do the behavior, benefits to doing the behavior, and reasons for not doing the behavior in the same list. This is another example of how you can ask. So this is some work done in Northern California around adjusting hot water heater temperatures when going on vacation or overall. And so each of the statements are reasons that they may or may not engage in the behavior. So here it says, the following statements are reasons you might leave the temperature of your water heater at it as is, using a scale from 0, strongly agree, to 10, strongly agree. How much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? So these are things that are barriers. Hotter water is needed to kill bacteria. I don't know how to change the temperature. It's too difficult. I prefer having hotter water. Please list any other reasons. So for each of those, there are reasons that people would not engage in the behavior, rated from 0 to 10. And then the next set, following statements are reasons you might lower your hot water heater temperature. So reasons you might do it. Hot water heater temperature reduces risk of scalding, saves money, better for the planet. So again, you see we're listing all of the barriers and benefits here and then providing them an option to offer any others that maybe didn't make our list. So here's another example from regarding trash. And so here we're asking, again, time constrained. In the past 6 months, I have left a trash bag at the curb for trash collection instead of a bin. So we're asking about current behavior. And then we're asking, okay, so if they didn't do the right thing, then what is the primary reason they did not? So what is the main reason to place your trash in a bin and not in a bag at the curb? And so they're indicating categorically what the primary reason. And then below that, here are some reasons why people might leave a trash bag at the curb, using a reason from 0 to 10. And then we've listed a range of both barriers and benefits in that. Moving bins is a hassle. My HOA cites me. It's my habit. I have a hard time. My trash bin is broken. So again, this allows us from that 0 to 10 to be able to compare those barriers one to another and rate them quantitatively. So just a couple of different ways you can ask about barriers depending on your particular topic. The other content piece that's common in surveys of any type is demographics. And this is an area where you want to be really careful. It's tempting to want to know everything about everybody in your audience, but again, we need to give thought to the objective and what you need to know and the relevance of that to your research question. So demographics are things like education, home ownership, level of training, age, maybe their job title, their financial, how much money they make, their household income. So a whole range of things, but we always be thinking about, does the topic that you're asking about relate to the demographic that you want to know? So if you're talking about picking up pet waste on walks, is knowing about their household income really relevant to that behavior, as much as that same demographic might be relevant to installing living shorelines, things that you know cost is going to be an element. So similarly, is home ownership something that you need to know about for the behavior, or is their level of education important? So asking only those that are relevant. Typically, demographics are placed at the end of the survey. There's quite a bit of research around the idea that if you ask people about key items such as gender, economic status, or knowledge up front, then all of their answers after are you've sort of primed their thinking and their identity around that topic, and the answers that follow can be biased from that. And so typically these questions like gender, ethnicity, income levels, education levels, those are typically placed at the end of the survey so that they don't influence the way that people respond. With a few exceptions. The primary exception there being if that question is needed to classify people or move people down one path or another. So for example, if a certain set of questions are only relevant to people who are homeowners, then you need to be asking that up front in order to know whether people are going to be asked the next set of questions or not, or if they are dog owners or not, or if they have a yard or not, or if they have a shoreline or not. Those are demographic questions that you will want to ask in order to qualify them for other questions. So lastly, in writing the questions, you want to really think about, so we've talked about scales, we've talked about the specific types of items you need, but in actually writing the items and the language that you use, there are some other considerations. First is to avoid abbreviations unless they are common. So here's an area where you want to consider the audience that you're approaching. A common abbreviation would be something like USA, or if there's a local university that everybody knows, and using that abbreviation would be appropriate. But using things like BMP or even abbreviations of your own organization would not necessarily be things that your audience is going to be familiar with. So even though you might understand that internally, writing the surveys, it's important to spell those out in the actual survey document. You also want to be careful to avoid slang and colloquialisms. This, again, may seem obvious, but we do see things turn up in surveys that maybe to us they make sense, but where they don't make sense very often is people who are non-native speakers. So using words like you would want to use things like do an internet search instead of Google it, or in your response item. So how do you find information about how much fertilizer to apply in your list of options? If you put something like Google it, that's something that may change over time, right, and become less popular or may not be as known to certain groups. So you want to use the actual non-slang statements, so use internet search. Another example would be colloquialisms like a ballpark figure. So give me a ballpark figure about how much you spend on fertilizers in the year. Some terms like that, again, might be well known to a native English speaker, but to someone who's a non-native or maybe comes from another place, that might not be as well known. So it's very important to kind of go back and make sure that you've not included those. And then lastly, jargon and technical expressions. So again, considering your audience and whether they would have understanding of industry terms or technical terms. If you are surveying the general public and you use the term like living shoreline, they may not know what that is, whereas if you're surveying experts who are, or ecologists or water quality experts, they are going to be more familiar with that term. So matching the language to the audience is another consideration. Ultimately, for each item, a good check is to kind of follow this logic pattern. So for each one, ask yourself, is this a question that can be asked exactly as written? So we want to make sure that when asking questions, that questions are asked consistently. If the question needs to be explained, then each interviewer is going to wind up explaining it in a different way, and it's going to introduce a lot of error and bias into your responses. So we want the questions to be written clearly, that it can be asked exactly as written without a bunch of extra explanation. Is it a question that will mean the same thing to everyone? So are the concepts clear and defined and using relevant terms? Is it a question that people can answer? So again, using things like time constraining and being specific about the behavior, make it easier for people to answer it than more abstract questions. And then lastly, is it a question that people will be willing to answer? Is it something that is very private, that they're not going to be willing to answer? Then you may want to get rid of those questions, unless they're absolutely needed. So once you have that first version of the survey, a couple of things that are good practices, and understand, time constraints, these things sometimes get skipped, but they're really good practices to ensure that, again, you have a strong instrument for that one time you have to go out in your audience and gather this data. So the first step would be an expert review, and this would be in particular if you're asking about technical topics. So this would be having someone who is familiar with the topic, someone familiar with pesticide use or tree planting or living shorelines or whatever it is the topic that you're asking about. Are you using terminology that is correct? Are you asking about behaviors that are correct? Or are there key elements that are missing in terms of tree planting? So maybe you forget to ask about the need to call the utility because you didn't realize that was a step. So having people who are very familiar with the behavior review the survey can really give you some good insights and save you from getting to that point later on where you don't have the data you need. The expert review can also, again, be a kind of a second check. Does it fit to the mission? They can help you with wording and ensure you that the data that you get at the end, again, is relevant to the behavior you're asking about and to the overall topic. So that's sort of your first level of review. That can happen really quickly by emailing the survey out. Very often as consultants, when we write a survey, we're sending it to our client or working group that's familiar with the topic. And I know Katie's gone back and forth on surveys related to living shorelines, for example, where a lot of feedback from experts to get the wording right on the questions and the terminology right and the behaviors right. That back and forth really makes a stronger instrument. The second level of review is an audience review. So still, again, before going out into the public, we do something that's called a cognitive interview. And this is getting someone from your target population, and it doesn't need to be randomly selected. Typically, it's maybe a friend or family member or coworker or someone who's unfamiliar with the topic area. So outside of your office, unfamiliar with the topic area. And we do what's called a cognitive interview. And that is going through each item on the survey and asking them what that item means to them, kind of how they're interpreting the question, is the terminology clear. This can be a little bit time-consuming initially, but it's going to save you a lot of time in the field and having to clarify terms that people don't understand. So, if you say something, one of my favorite examples here from San Diego where we have a lot of military present, and we had asked something about marine life, and the interpretation of the participant in these initial interviews was that marine life referred to the military life, the life of being a Marine or being a Marine wife or living in a military town, whereas we really meant marine life as, fish and things that swim in the ocean. So it's kind of enlightening sometimes when these terms that we're so used to, and you take them out to a target audience and they're really not as familiar. So those are the kinds of things you're looking for in those cognitive interviews. And then the second piece that you're looking for in those cognitive interviews is timing. So typically with an intercept survey, we want to keep those no more than 10 to 12 minutes, usually shorter, depending on the topic. And so really, once you've kind of refined the survey, walking through that one time and making sure that you're giving people an accurate representation of how long the survey is going to take. So it's considered unethical to tell people, oh, can you participate in a 5-minute survey when that survey actually takes 15 or 20. We want to be honest upfront with what is the time and effort commitment that you're going to be asking of the participant. So again, this can be done very quickly, both the expert interview and audience review, though I've added steps into the development process, save you a lot of time on the back end, and really don't take that much time to complete. So next, thinking about actually conducting the survey. And so as Katie mentioned, where you do the survey may vary depending on the type of people you want to get. So if you want homeowners, you might be going to home improvement stores and to get a higher proportion of homeowners. If you want people who own horses, you might go to feed stores to try to find those people. Or if you want people who ride transit, as in this example, you might be going to bus stops or transit centers to get people who you know ride transit. So there's some thought that needs to be given to intercept surveys and how you find your audience. But then you want to be thinking about appropriate time constraints for that audience. So if this is, if you're doing surveys at an event where people are milling around for a lot of time, you might have more time. They might be willing to talk to you for 7 to 10 minutes. If you're getting people who are waiting to get into an event or waiting to, in this example again, ride the bus, you may only have a very short amount of time with them. So you need to be thinking about how much time is that participant going to feasibly be able to offer you to answer the question. This other thing to think about in conducting surveys is to schedule those around busy times. So if you schedule your interviews during times that people are going to be busy, then you're likely to get low response rates. So a couple examples of these, we did some intercept surveys that were done at the door, so at people's homes, door to door, in Texas, in the state of Texas, and we learned very quickly that we could not do surveys during the times that college football was on because people were not willing. So learning something about the local culture and what they're involved in. So Sundays during church time might not be a good time. Around the holidays is typically not a good time. People are in a hurry. They're hustling and bustling to go here and there. Whereas late afternoons, if you're trying to get people that have kids at home, young children at home, late afternoons might be good, right before they are off making dinner. So thinking again about your audience and where you're intercepting the audience and scheduling those interviews around times that are busy. The other thing that we like to recommend, even though it doesn't happen very often, the temptation is to you've got your survey and you go out in the survey and then maybe you go one weekend and then, you don't have staff, so you go out another weekend and you just kind of like slowly gather data. The challenge in doing that, or the risk in doing that, is that other things can happen during that data collection period that could start influencing responses. So there could be a hurricane, or there could be a political change, with elections and things like that. And now suddenly people are paying attention to different things. They're hearing different messages. They're concerned about different things. And so we really want that survey to be a snapshot in time. So to time constrain the data collection to the smallest window possible will reduce the likelihood that these other real-world interferences will come into play. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can enhance participation in the survey. So you've spent all this time to write a good survey. If people don't participate, and you're not going to get that data that you worked so hard to get. So one way, to enhance participation is to first send a pre-notification letter. This isn't work in all cases. This isn't something that you're going to do if you're getting people out in public space, but it is something that if you're doing intercept surveys maybe at a business, or you're going door to door, by sending letters ahead of time, letting people know that interviewers will be in their neighborhood, that they're going to be asking about these topics, that the time will be, that it will take 5 to 7 minutes, any information about how they might be compensated for their time, including that in a very succinct pre-notification letter that really highlights the importance of their participation, keeps them on the lookout, and increases the likelihood that someone's going to answer the door, or that the manager is going, if you're doing businesses, for example, will come out and talk to you. But it's giving them sort of that heads up ahead of time. Another way to enhance participation is to work through gatekeepers. So that is finding out who in the organization, maybe it's if you're trying to talk to technical experts, you might work through a office manager or HR coordinator to sort of vouch for you in doing the survey. Third is very carefully training your interviewers. I can't say enough about this. We have a whole entire webinar just on this. Training the interviewers so that they understand the questions, that they understand how to select participants, so that they understand how to respond to questions that the participants might have, and that they understand the topics that they're asking about is essential to enhancing participation. Also in that training is just how they present themselves, how they approach people, how they dress, how they maintain eye contact. This training really conveys the professionalism and credibility that you need to get people to comply with your request to participate. The other related to that, and kind of ties in, because when you provide them that training, you're sending interviewers out into the field that are confident. And that confidence really helps. It's kind of a interesting mechanism by which it happens, but if an interview is confident and goes out and approaches a person expecting a yes and knowledgeable about the topic, they're more likely to get a yes response than if they're very timid about it. Like, well, I was wondering if you would participate in my survey, and it's not going to take very long. That kind of timid attitude gives people an easy out. So, but conversely, if you're expecting a yes, then it sort of implies this social norm. Well, other people must have said yes if he's coming to me so confidently. So these are just some tricks of the trade that we've learned that can really help. One of the other key ways to make sure that people comply and that they want to participate is establishing credibility. And the primary way in which we do this is reducing people's uncertainty about participation. So if you've gone anywhere out in town, out and about any town, you've probably been solicited for something, whether it's a credit card application to candy bars to right now it's Girl Scout cookies every time you go to the grocery store. So there's no uncertainty related to Girl Scouts, right? Because they have their uniforms, they have their stand, we know who they are, you know what they're there to do. But often with our researchers, you've got maybe a badge and a clipboard, but you still need to establish some credibility with that participant very quickly. The Girl Scouts have had decades to do it. You've got a very brief moment to establish credibility and make that person willing to talk to you and share with you their experiences. So the key things to cover off in this very introductory statement is, who are you? So what is your name and who do you represent? How and why was that person selected? So we are talking to a random selection of Joe's nursery shoppers today. And then what will be asked? We're asking you about your perceptions of planting trees and how long it will take. It'll take about 5 minutes, or it'll take about 7 minutes. If you can cover all 4 of those in a sentence, you've pretty much nailed the credibility that you need to get people to comply with your request or not. Once you have that credibility established, you can go a little bit further to establish the importance of what you want to do. Why is that input needed? So we'll say things like, the information in this survey will help us to inform outreach programs across the Chesapeake Bay. How will the data be used? The data will be used to help us make key decisions about our program. Or we might say something like, you are one of just 50 people that we're talking to help us develop our program. So you really want to establish both the importance of their participation, but the importance also of the information that they're going to provide to you. So you've established who you are, you've established the importance of your participation, and then the last piece that's very helpful is assuring the participant of their confidentiality. And so I just take a moment to differentiate between anonymity versus confidentiality, because we see this come up in surveys quite often. Anonymity is we don't know who that person is. They've completed it online, they're nothing but an IP address, and we can't link their data back to that person in any way. That's an anonymous response. Or they've picked up a card, a survey card at a booth, and they've dropped it into a bin with all kinds of other survey cards. There's no name or identifying information on that. That's an anonymous survey. A confidential survey is most of the time, in fact, all of the time that you're doing an intercept survey, it's not confidential. You know who that person is, it's not anonymous. That person is telling you their responses, but you can assure them that their responses will be held confidential. So you're not going to print their responses in the newspaper along with their name, that their responses are going to be combined with others and kept confidential. That's something that's really important to assure people of, especially if you're asking about more difficult topics or private behaviors or even behaviors related to their property or the way they spend money and so on. So ensuring people of their confidentiality, which is different than anonymity. So those are sort of the key topics in terms of, Katie reviewed the various research methods that are available to you, and now we've kind of gone into how to develop a good survey. You hopefully, whether you develop survey yourself or you have a consultant do it, feel a bit more informed about how the critical questions you should be asking of yourselves or of your consultant. But as I mentioned, we could teach a whole course on survey development, and we could teach a whole course around each one of the modes that Katie covered. So here I want to direct you to a few additional resources that we use regularly and always recommend to others. First and foremost is the tailored design method. That's pictured on the lower left there. It's now in its 4th edition, so it used to just talk about phone surveys. Now it's been modified to cover internet surveys, phone surveys, mail surveys, and mixed mode, which is typically, starting with phone and following up with mail, or starting with mail, following up with phone, but you're combining modes. This book has not only instructional information for how to write good surveys, a lot of the information I've provided today, but it provides that information across each of these different modes, how you structure phone surveys, how you structure mail surveys, and how, specifically, we use the book with mail to how you can get good response rates using a mail survey. So all of those best practices, internet surveys, everything from, the order in which you present the questions to the wording in the email. There's a lot of examples of surveys. I know I've provided a few on this webinar, but there's examples of surveys, there's examples of pre-notification letters, examples of follow-up letters. That's really useful, sort of the Bible of survey implementation. The second is called the Survey Kit. This is a set of smaller guides put together by Sage Publications, and related to that, the Focus Group Kit. And so it's got small handbooks on recruiting participants, small handbooks on writing questions, analyzing the data, breaks it down into meaningful pieces or digestible pieces. That's a helpful kit if you are sort of dividing and conquering, so that not everybody needs to read this whole book, but you can kind of access it for different pieces. And then lastly, there's a professional association called the American Association for Public Opinion Research. We belong to that organization, and it's an organization that we followed for best practices in research methodologies across all of these different modes that Katie talked about. They focus especially right now on telephone surveying and kind of monitoring the landscape of cell phone use and privacy and issues like that. So it's a great organization. They have white papers, they have listserv, they have an annual conference. Really good organization, and these are academics and practitioners who are both studying advances in methodologies, but also applying different methodologies and kind of circling back. So we follow that to sort of monitor best practices because they do change. The way that we did intercept surveys, 15 years ago has become more refined over time as people are more concerned about privacy. We have social media has come into the landscape, and so there's different concerns and different challenges, and so that helps us to stay on top of that. And then kind of circling back to the last webinars, there's some other resources on community-based social marketing specifically that I've included here for you. And then just a reminder that the next webinar will dive deeper into strategy development. So we've covered behavior selection through the first one, a little bit of a deeper dive into how to go about identifying barriers and benefits. And then on the next webinar, we'll talk about how do you translate the information that you do gather into the development of a strategy. So with that, we will use the last 14 minutes or so to address any questions you might have, either in the room or on the phone, or if Katie wants to add anything else.
Good. Rachel, were there any questions in the chat box?
Nope, none in the chat box. Do you guys have any here? Nope. Anybody else on the phone have any questions?
Are there any concerns or sort of internal challenges that you see with implementing intercept surveys or any of the methods that maybe have covered that come to mind?
So I have something I was going to ask. This is Sally. I know you can hear me. But I was just wondering if you provide that service to look, to help with the survey question protocol. I didn't hear you offering that. I can't remember, Rachel, if that was part of this, but I can see how this would be really helpful. And also just finding the right place and way to do the surveys.
So,
yes.
Sally,
I'll let Rachel take the first part of that.
Yeah, I was just going to start. So unfortunately, no, we don't have any that's not part of this particular scope of work under this project, at least for us being able to provide additional support. But I'll go back to Jennifer now.
Yeah, so there, under this particular contract, our goal is to educate you as much as possible on how to do it and provide you resources to utilize to do it internally. We, as an organization, though, separately from this contract, do very often will contract with agencies to provide everything from just reviewing a survey all the way up to developing, implementing, and analyzing a survey. So there are consulting firms like ours out there that you can reach out to. There are also often, if you reach out to your local universities, you can find graduate students or others that are willing to offer their expertise in a particular area or help you with some survey design as part of their project. So a couple of different ways to go about that. And then Katie, I'll turn it to Katie to address a little bit about how you go about picking sites and some considerations you might want to think about in picking where to go for different types of intercept surveys. I don't know, maybe she doesn't hear me.
Sorry, there's someone talking outside my house. Can you repeat that?
Oh, Katie, I was just, part of Sally's question was how to identify where you might do surveys. So what are some of the considerations in trying to figure out whether a place is appropriate or you're going to get the right people? I know you've done quite a few of those recently.
Yeah, so one of the locations we tend to always start with, at least being on our list, is libraries, just because they do attract and they become more popular in recent times with a variety of audiences. You know, you can get anything from parents, people go and check out movies there, students using it to study. You can get a wider group of people there, and libraries are typically very willing to let people stand outside or even inside them, especially if you're conducting research at a time when it's colder and you need to be inside. That can be a very good location. Otherwise, looking at if there is something you need for them to qualify to answer your survey. So Jennifer showed one earlier that had salt use as one of the topics, and to qualify for that survey, you need to be someone who owns or rents a home that has property space that you would put salt on and that you have used salt at some point. So potentially looking at home improvement stores, as Jennifer mentioned, where people might be going to buy salt and such like that to try to get a higher number of qualifiers. We also often check in after day one with our interviewers and see, did a bunch of people that they asked not qualify and why, and looking through, okay, do we need to reconsider what location we're going to based on that information, or as the space that we found have a lot of people. We just had one recently where we shifted midday because we needed town residents, and we found that the day we had chosen in the area we'd chosen had a large running event nearby, I think it was, something that had attracted a lot of out-of-towners. So we were getting just lots of people walking by us who just didn't qualify. So we switched from the street we were on to one closer to the post office where we were getting more residents of the town.
Yeah, so there's a number of things you have to consider. I think again, it's helpful to go back to that objective statement that you wrote at the beginning and what you need to learn from your audience and who your audience needs to be. In terms of efficiency, we do try to pick places that have higher volume and places where we can get permission. So we tend to prioritize public spaces over private spaces because we don't need to get permission in many cases, but there have been many cases where we've been able to get local management level approval for a home improvement store or pet store or something like that, and that can be really useful. One way in which you can enhance that too, we found, is if you're providing people with a incentive for participating in the survey, that if you purchase, say, gift cards from that particular store, that provides an incentive back to the site also for participating. So we did some with people who changed their own motor oil, and we purchased the incentive for participating in that. We did these in front of auto parts stores, and so we gave people a $5 gift card for that auto parts store. So you've made a purchase now in the store, which helps them, and then people are more likely to go in and buy something because they now have a gift card to use. So that's kind of a way to help enhance your likelihood of an approval for a site.
This is Amy. I wanted to also respond to Sally's question about the assistance available to develop, design, and implement a survey. And we were able to acquire a contractor through the GET funding process to help us gather stewardship behavior data. So there is somebody, he is a contractor in the Bay watershed who is very well versed in this type of work and very familiar with Bay Program Partnership. And earlier you asked about challenges associated with conducting surveys, and I just wanted to reiterate the challenge of developing the ICR, so that in addition to the large body of work to develop and collect data, there is the ICR piece, which is really important for us.
Great. Were there any other challenges or questions anyone has they wanted to get some insight on?
I was just going to add to that piece, if anybody is looking to do this and has questions about the ICR, I think Amy and I are very well versed in it now. Just let us know. Any other questions from folks on the phone or challenges they want to bring up? All right, I think we're good here, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all again on the next one.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.